tonight at the Chautauqua Cinema, something called Nuremberg. It's Lessons for Today, as Sandra Schulberg will present her 35mm restoration of her father Stuart Schulberg's 1948 film documenting the Nuremberg trials and the establishment of the Nuremberg principles, laying the groundwork for all subsequent prosecutions anywhere in the world for crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And I know you have spent an incredible amount of time and effort getting to this point where tonight here, July 5th, 2011 at Chautauqua, you're here, and I'm so thrilled to have you here.
I'm pretty thrilled too.
What made you, what pumped you up to do this project?
Well, it was a slow burn. I only saw the film for the first time, Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
And I was watching the German version. I became interested in what had happened to the film at that point. It coincided with the fact that I had recently, my brothers and I had recently emptied my mom's apartment. Mm-hmm. She died in 2002. And at the end of 2003, we finally got around to emptying the apartment. And we found boxes and boxes of documents that my father had saved and then that she had saved about the making of Nuremberg. I didn't actually start to look through and try to inventory those documents until the spring of 2004, right after I had seen Nuremberg as I recollect it for the first time. And this became, for want of a better expression, the perfect storm, seeing the film and then finding the documents, trying to understand the story that these documents were revealing. And that set me on this, what turned out to be a now 6-year quest to get to the bottom of this story, find out why the film was never released in the United States, which turned into a detective story in its own right, and also tackle the restoration of the film.
Now that you've done your Sherlock Holmes best to ascertain what happened, your dad was authorized by the Army Department of Army, to put together a documentary on the Nuremberg trial. It got so far and played in Germany, as I understand it, and then it was not permitted in the United States. In fact, John Barrett provided me with a letter, which I'm sure he did you, where Jackson was very miffed that he was unable to show that. Why did they can it?
Well, first of all, we have to backtrack. Stuart Schulberg not only made the film about the trial, but part of the story that I've been researching and trying to tell now is the fact that both he and my uncle Bud Schulberg, as you know, were sent to Nuremberg by their boss, Navy Commander John Ford, to, first of all, locate the Nazi film evidence that Jackson and his team of prosecutors wanted to actually show in the courtroom. This was a historic decision in its own right, to try to use motion pictures as a form of legal evidence in a court of law. That was a huge mission and difficult mission in its own right, which started during the summer of 1945 with both Bud and Stuart, these two sons of Hollywood, on assignment to scour Germany and the other occupied territories and look for this film evidence. They spent months doing this, and according to Bud, the only reason that they finally had enough time to find and assemble this material for the courtroom was because the trial was postponed several times. It was originally supposed to start in September, then it was postponed till October, then it was postponed finally till towards the end of November. And yet they were working on the Nazi plan up until the last minute. So they ended up compiling 2 major films for the courtroom. One was this almost 4-hour epic called The Nazi Plan, which consisted entirely of films that had been shot by cameramen for the German Reich, and that they presented in the courtroom December 13, I believe. They also put together a 1-hour film that they called simply Nazi concentration camps, which Jackson and James Donovan, who was the main interface on his staff between the Office of Chief of Counsel and the film unit, decided to show very early in the trial on, I believe, November 29. And that film really shook up the courtroom. And in fact, I later found a remarkable letter that my father wrote in which he describes the fact that they wanted to see the faces of the defendants while they were watching this film. And they had arranged for lighting around the edge of the dock to illuminate their faces. But on the morning of the screening, they discovered that this was going to shed too much light on their faces and wash out them and the screen possibly as well. So Stewart was on his knees, according to this letter he wrote, on his knees covering up some of the lighting with brown kind of electrical tape or masking tape, having forgotten that the prisoners were brought up 2 by 2 starting at 9 o'clock. The proceedings didn't start till 10, but they started to bring the prisoners up at 9, and suddenly he found Goering, who always had the front left seat if you're looking at the dock, and was brought in first. He suddenly had Goering stepping over him as he was crouched down on the floor, tampering with this lighting. And he says in this letter that Goering immediately knew that they were going to show film and that they wanted to see the reactions of the faces. Yes, and my father writes that he had a big smile on his face, but that an hour later the smile was wiped off his face.
Were they pleased with the result? When it finally was shown, and I know producers, directors, they look at it on the screen and they're their worst critics.
Well, the letters that my father wrote are very interesting on this. I mean, on November 9th, he wrote a letter home. All these letters were addressed to my mom, and part of the reason we have such a remarkable record of exactly where he was, not such a specific record of where Bud was, but a very specific record of where Stewart was from June 22 all the way through to Christmas of 1945, is because he was newly married to my mom, and he was so in love with her that he was writing letters practically every day, and these were long typewritten letters that ran 8, 10, 12 pages. So they included a lot of description of what he was doing, where he was. You can plot his geography. And in a letter that he wrote dated November 9, he wrote that a number of the lawyers on Jackson's staff had been very skeptical about the decision to try to use film as evidence. But towards the end, he says, we finally managed to make these stuffy attorneys picture conscious. Now they're calling us for, hard to find shots of Rader giving the Nazi salute, or Kaltenbrunner at Mauthausen, where he was claiming he never was. And we are putting these films together hand in hand with the prosecutors. And then at the end of the letter he writes, Jackson is very pleased with our work. He even called to congratulate us, and he cracked, a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Wow. So
we have, Stewart reporting Jackson's faith in what they were doing and satisfaction with what they were doing. But, until the film was shown in the courtroom, they had no idea what impact it would have. And I do think from my own interviews with people who were involved in the trial that the courtroom films did have an impact and did play a part, as much psychologically as juridically, I think. They also apparently, according to Persico's book, the concentration camp film may have had an impact on Hess and his apparent shift. I don't know if we can call it a decision, but the result was that he snapped out of his either real or feigned amnesia, apparently on the night after that film was shown, and from then on more or less participated in the trial. And we have a letter from Stewart, which is also fascinating, from several weeks earlier, in which he describes the fact that in an effort to jolt Hess out of his amnesia, they had brought him down to the editing room in the courthouse where the OSS team was operating and was putting these films together, and showed him extreme footage to see if it would have an impact. And Stewart wrote that whether this was real amnesia or fake, he never betrayed an ounce of recognition. He was unfazed by what they showed him. And they were very disappointed that these films hadn't had that impact. But when it was shown in the courtroom, according to the report of one of the psychologists, it did, and Persico reiterates this, it did have an impact.
When that particular two work products was concluded, Nazi plan and the concentration camp, did they then immediately start, did your dad get the assignment then to work on a documentary?
No, what happened is, and again, we know this from Budd and Stewart's letters home, that they were sent home shortly after the Nazi plan was presented in the courtroom. They were very eager to be home by Christmas, and they got home by Christmas. Now, Stewart also writes that there had been a possibility that he'd be asked to stay on and report on the trial. But in the end, that didn't happen. He was torn, because on the one hand, he very much wanted to stay and be allowed to report on the trial, and on the other hand, he was dying to get home to his new wife. So the Marine Corps, the OSS, made the decision for him, and he and Budd were both sent home, as were the rest of their OSS film unit, Ray Kellogg, Bob Webb, Bob Parrish. They all went home before Christmas. And it wasn't until the following November, in other words, just a month after the trial ended, in November 1946, that we find Stewart's first outline for the film to be made about the trial. And in December of 46, the government contract is issued by the War Department, officially engaging him to write and direct this film.
Now, Père Laurence is involved in this also. What is his role?
Père Laurence is the man who hired my father.
Okay.
Père was not involved in any way in the preparation of the evidentiary films that were presented in the courtroom. That was all under the aegis of Bill Donovan and John Ford, although Ford never came over to personally supervise any of that.
Jim Donovan or Bill Donovan?
Bill Donovan.
Bill Donovan, okay.
Yeah, it's confusing, but General William, or Bill Donovan, was founder and head of the OSS, and he, as you know, he had hoped in a sense to co-prosecute the trial with Jackson. They had a major falling out about the approach to be taken during the trial, and Donovan left Nuremberg several weeks before the trial started. But Ford reported Donovan. Ford was head of the OSS film unit all the way through the war, and both the Schulberg brothers worked for Ford all the way through the war, making basically secret training films for OSS operatives. So there was a logic to, Jackson turning the mission over to Donovan, Donovan turning the mission over to Ford, and Ford turning the mission over to Ray Kellogg, Bud Schulberg, and Stuart Schulberg. Père Laurence, who was an Air Force colonel, had spent the war filming bombing missions. But after the war, he was made head of film, theater, and music. Believe it or not, we had such a division in the Civil Affairs Division of the War Department. And it was in that capacity that he was given the job of supervising the creation of this official film about the trial on behalf of the Department of War.
Okay.
So it was his job to figure out who would make this film. He hired Stewart. Unfortunately for Pear and for Stewart, military government in Berlin had their own ideas about how this film should be made, and a huge battle broke out between the so-called film officers on General Clay's staff in Berlin and Pear and Stewart. The people in Berlin were claiming that first of all, that this film should be a film exclusively for German audiences, and that only they, on the ground over there, were qualified to determine how that film should be made to best reach its target. Jackson and Secretary of War Stimson and Père Lorentz and Stuart Schulberg were all of the opinion that no, that this was a film for posterity, that the whole world should see, because not just the German public, but the whole world should see what had happened at Nuremberg. So they had a very different philosophical approach to the film, a very different juridical approach to the film. They wanted the film to really reflect the structure of the trial. And the people in Berlin were using the trial as sort of a backdrop, but they wanted to include a lot of other stuff. And so you can see from the memos that I inherited, the papers that we inherited, that this became quite a vicious argument that went back and forth. And ultimately, what is also fascinating is that the only person who had the authority to rule on which approach should be undertaken was Justice Jackson.
Okay.
I have the letter from Jackson to Pear. You can tell from the letter that Jackson has been asked to read the 3 competing scripts. Clay's office in Berlin had put forth 2 scripts. First one that Pear and Stewart rejected outright, and a second one that Stewart's memo shows they thought was somewhat better, but still didn't reflect the structure of the trial. And then the Schulberg script, which you can see from the very first outline, uses the 4 counts of the indictment as its narrative spine.
You mentioned Philbrick. Who's he?
It mentioned who?
Philbrick? Did you say the last? What was the name you used? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought you put a definition of that 3rd script. What was it called?
No, I said that they put forth 2 scripts. One was both of which were
But the Berlin ones. Those are the.
they were both put forward by men on General Clay's staff in Berlin. Yeah, and Jackson was asked to read both these scripts. And his letter says that, in his opinion, only the Schulberg script, which he names as the Schulberg script, accurately reflects the structure of the trial and should be used as the basis for this film. So that finally gave Pear the authority, followed up by a letter from Stimson to Clay saying, we're sending Schulberg and the editor Joe Zygmunt over, and we're asking you to provide all necessary support. So they were then sent to Berlin to actually make the film. Now, for other reasons that I'm still trying to fully substantiate, Pear ultimately resigned from the War Department and from the project effective June 1, 1947, due to frustrations with the larger bureaucracy and some of the people he was reporting to. And then, 2 years later, but in his telegram to my father, he says, he hopes to remain involved from the sidelines, and he wishes my father, all Godspeed getting this difficult project done. About a year and a half later, when the film was finally completed, the records show that Pear was shown a cut of the film along with Justice Jackson and Justice Frankfurter and a number of other people. And it gradually began to dawn on both Justice Jackson and Pear Lorentz that the government was not going to allow the film to be released. This is a long and fascinating story in itself, but suffice to say that thanks to John Barrett, only very recently have I finally gotten my hands on the first official letter that I found, and as I say, it was John who found it, that clearly indicates that the government has decided as a conscious policy not to allow the film to be released generally in the United States. The letter is signed by our Secretary of the Army, Kenneth Royal, who was subordinate to Stimson. Stimson had a different view, but it appears that it was Royal who had the authority to decide what to do about the film. And interestingly, the letter is dated much earlier than I expected. It's dated November 1948. And what's also interesting about the letter is that it's addressed to Justice Jackson. Jackson, as we know, really wanted this film made, really wanted it released in the US, and was clearly pressing the government as to when it was going to be released. And in the letter, Royal says, our policies have changed, and in my opinion, this film is not in the interest of the Army or our nation as a whole, and we will not be releasing it to the general public at this time.
Jackson was not a happy guy. I read someplace, and maybe this is part of what your conversation is, that he was to make a presentation before either the New York Bar Association and wanted access to the film, and it was denied.
What's interesting about Royal's letter is that he goes on to say to Jackson, but I have no objection to certain people who were involved in the trial or others who might have a need to know seeing the film, and we will allow, certain private screenings of the film. But 10 months later, the Washington Post reported, when it finally figured out that this was a story, that the film was not being released, and they quoted Jackson as saying that he had asked to borrow a copy of the film to show to a private meeting of the New York Bar Association and had been refused. And he wound up showing the Russian film instead, which is a whole other subplot in all this, fascinating story in itself, and was pretty ticked off about this. And the Washington Post quotes him as saying, more or less, how on earth do we expect to compete with the Soviets in Europe if we can't even meet them on our own terms in New York City? Yeah. So he was irate about this. And it does show, I think, because this was a sitting Supreme Court justice, had been the chief prosecutor at the trial, was in a way the star of the film, and they were so concerned about this film that they wouldn't even allow him to show it to a meeting of the New York Bar Association. I mean, that really tells you something, I think, about their concerns about this film. And so you ask, why was it suppressed? The short answer is that the film became a victim of the Cold War. The people at the State Department were concerned because by now official policy was rebuilding of Germany. In '49, which is when the Post finally got onto this story, Germany had been invited to become an official, full-fledged, equal member of the Marshall Plan, community of nations. We had helped them hold their first democratic elections, and we were relying on Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansionism and fighting hard for the right to remain in Berlin. That's what Clay said, General Clay, in the middle of the Berlin blockade. We have a right to be in Berlin, and we intend to maintain that right. So the Berlin blockade had just ended, but that was really one of the flashpoints in the whole, beginning of the Cold War. And the State Department, I think, was afraid that if you showed this film to Americans across the country in their local movie theaters, that you would remind them of how much they really hated the Nazis and maybe Germans and by extension Germany, and undermine support for the rebuilding of Germany, undermine support for maybe even the Marshall Plan, or at least the Marshall Plan's support of Germany. So that was one main concern. Another concern was that at the trial, as you see in the film, is very evident, we were allied with the Soviets. And by this time, the Soviets were the enemy. There was a lot of, it was not only U.S. government policy, but there were people in Congress and out of Congress who were, even fomenting the fear that the communists might be taking over our own government. And there was this, talk of the Red Menace. So the film became politically incorrect or awkward because we're seen as allied with the Soviets. So that was another concern. But there may also have been a third problem, which the Washington Post highlighted. The Post reporter describes Kenneth Royal himself as having been opposed to the trial because military officers were included in the dock. And this is a somewhat darker, I would say, factor, that this notion that there's an international military solidarity that makes certain military officers uncomfortable with the notion that not only civilian leaders should be held accountable, but military leaders should be held accountable. And this is one of the significant sequences in the film when some of the people testify that, that the armed forces should be ashamed of what they allowed to have happen in Germany, that the Germany's own military nobility was sucked into the Reich's madness and totally subjugated. There were some, of course, German military officers who resisted that, but many, many others who didn't. And a number of the five top military officers were put on trial in the first trial. We know also that Admiral Nimitz, for instance, sent an affidavit in support of Admiral Dönitz. So this notion, this discomfort with the idea of putting military leaders on trial, military leaders who are supposedly subordinate to civilian leaders, was a source of friction and may have also played a part in Royal's own vehemence on this issue.
Interesting, because he was involved in that saboteurs trial as well. Back in 1943 when the Nazis brought in the 8 Nazis were found on American soil.
Right.
And Kenneth Royal was involved in that trial. Before I forget, the Russian documentary. What do we know about that?
Well, the story of the Russian film is as I said, a fascinating subplot with some humorous aspects. Nuremberg, the film that my father wound up making, was, believe it or not, originally supposed to be a 4-power production. They had formed something called the Documentary Film Working Party in Berlin with a delegate from each of the 4 prosecuting nations, and they were going to work together on making this official account of the Nuremberg trial, the first trial. Then this battle broke out for control of the film within the American sector between the War Department in Washington, represented by Per Lorentz, and represented on the bench by Justice Jackson, and General Clay's film officers in Berlin. This internal battle so delayed the attempt to achieve a common four-power consensus on how to approach the film that the Russians lost patience with the whole process and bolted the working party and made their own film using the same courtroom footage and many of the same evidentiary, and with access to the same evidentiary films.
I'm going to stop you there because I know there's, as I've read, 25 hours of actual film of the Nuremberg trial, the international military trial. And that's so each of them had access to copies and just used it the way they saw fit.
Well, the only two parties that attempted to make their own films were the Americans and the Russians. Yes, they both had access to that. And we now think that it may be slightly more than 25 hours. We're just in the process of ascertaining exactly how much footage was shot. But it was at least 25. It may have been as much as 35. We're just new information that Ray Farr and I are trying to sort out right now. So in any case...
And Ray Farr is at the Holocaust Museum.
Ray Farr, who's head of the director of the Steven Spielberg Film and Video Archive at the Holocaust Museum, has been in many ways my most enduring consultant on the restoration. There from the beginning, the first American scholar to look at my father's papers after I tried to start putting them in order, and the first one to give me a sense of how important they were, how unique they were, and to encourage me in many respects and help me with the restoration. And she and I continued to work together along with her staff on trying to unravel more and more of this story. Yeah. So in any case, the Russians had access to this material, and they also not only presented their own evidentiary films in the courtroom in February of '46, but they also had access to the films that the OSS film group put together. And from Bud's account, we know that some of what went into the Nazi plan was material that the Russians shared with them, because the Russians, coming from the east, took control of Berlin, which was where the big German film studio was, and a lot of film material was found there in Babelsberg. And there's a whole interesting, fun, actually, exchange between Bud and Ray Kellogg and their counterpart, Major Avenarius, on the Soviet side, who was a major film scholar and a huge admirer of John Ford's, who was so taken with the fact that they were working for John Ford that he wound up helping them and duplicating a lot of the film footage that they found at Babelsberg that was under Soviet control. So the evidentiary films, in a way, were something of a co-production. And again, this was when they were all allied. So in any case, this material was shared between the Soviets and the Americans, and the Russians made their own film. Their film, Sud Narodov, or Judgment of the People, looks remarkably like Stuart Schulberg's film. There's a different tone to it. It's much more acerbic. It's much more bitter about the Russian losses, and of course emphasizes the Russian losses, which were significant. They had a famous caricaturist at the trial who was drawing these hilarious, bitter portraits of each of the defendants, and the film cuts to these shots. So that introduces a kind of dark humor into their account of the trial. But in many ways, the films are very parallel. They first promised that they would only show the film in their zone. Then they had the chutzpah to, in the eyes of the Americans, to rent a major theater in Times Square in New York City to show their film. in the U.S., and their film was completed a full year before my father's film was completed. This gave rise to a big headline in Variety that said, Reds beat Yanks with true story of Nuremberg trial. And then, later on in the story it said, meanwhile, Schulberg and Ziegman are toiling away in Berlin on the American version of the trial. So this was a source of embarrassment for the Americans, that the Russians beat them to the punch with their own film, which they then had the chutzpah to show in the middle of New York City. And that's the film that Jackson is referring to when a year later, or 2 years later, when the Post reports that he had to show the Russian film to the New York Bar Association because our own government wouldn't give him our own government's film about the trial. It's a remarkable story.
Personally, I have had the black market copy, which is out there, of your dad's work, which of course every time you watch it you cringe because of the English talking head of Jackson, and then of course you got the Russian one, which is usually very grainy and it's just very old product. Did that bother you? I mean, you're accurate. I assume that what I was seeing for years, which is on the black market ones, that's the German part of your dad's work?
Let me try to explain this. First of all, I don't think it's accurate to use the word either bootleg or black market. Because this film was financed by the American government, when the government finally released it to our national archives, it became public domain, and any citizen, or not even a citizen, anyone in the world had the perfect right to go in and make a copy of it. I think the reason that you use a copy either of the unfinished English language version, which I'll explain, or of the German version, and I think the reason that you tend to refer to it as black market or bootleg is because generally these copies were so bad because people just went in and made what I call it, we used to call in the film business a, quote, dirty dupe, meaning just a, cheapest possible copy of a already not good copy. So, right. So these, and then there was the issue of the fact that the English language version didn't allow you to hear any of the English speakers speaking English.
Correct.
Now this is one of the mysteries that I had to try to solve before I attempted the so-called restoration of the film.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
And from reading through all these documents that I inherited, most of which are not public yet, I came to the conclusion that what happened was that my father, first of all, my father wrote the narration in English because English was his native language. They made a German translation. I found 11 copies of the script, different versions of the scripts all the way through the final recording copy in his papers. And so the original version was written in English. However, they wound up releasing the German version first because there was agreement about showing it in Germany. By the way, the picture cut is identical. The original picture was finalized in April of 1948, and the and the language versions were created at that time. Now, my conclusion is that because there were people at the War Department who had to see the film, that my father made what I call a temporary English language narration of the film. And by temporary, I mean that there were, people at Amgas, where he was based in Berlin, who read an English narration. The English narration told you what all the courtroom participants were saying, including the English speakers. My view is that if the government had decided to release the film, they would have authorized my father to spend the extra few $100s, which is all it would have cost at that time, to remix the film, and have the narrator read only that portion of the narration that did not cover the English speakers. It would have made no sense to release the film in the United States in a form in which you did not hear the English speakers, especially the great orator Robert H. Jackson. That defies comprehension. And I believe, this is my speculation, but I believe the documents sort of bear this out, that this would never have happened if the government had decided that it intended to release the film in movie theaters. The Washington Post called the version that they saw, this version, the rough, which I believe meant they were alluding to the sound, not the picture, which had been finalized. The German version, by the way, does the same thing. The German version tells you in German what everybody is saying in the courtroom. And I've since been asked to restore the German version of the film. So my decision, based on the documents and based on what we've learned about the suppression of the film, based on some of the comments my father made in his own letters about the importance of hearing the actual voices, my decision was to go back to the original sound recordings that were made at the trial and substitute the live sound from the courtroom for those parts of the narration that told you what they were saying. Now, I was very worried that in doing so, I might be changing the content of the film. I didn't know until we pulled in the live sound and I could compare it to the narration, whether they would perfectly match up or not. But the fact is that they did. In other words, Stewart's narration told you pretty much verbatim what was being said in the courtroom. So when we substituted the actual voices, we didn't change the content of the film.
That's great.
And that was a huge relief, but we didn't know that until we were actually in the midst of doing it. My conviction, though, simply based on Jackson's opening and closing statements, was that even if we could only substitute Jackson's voice, which was the first test that Josh Woletsky and I made, that even if we could only do that, we would significantly reanimate the film, that we would give audiences today the chance to hear Jackson's voice. If we could only do that, that we would have brought the film into the 21st century. Now, we also had to do, but of course then we went on and we did much more. We brought in the live sound of the German defendants, the German defense attorneys, the British prosecutors, the other American prosecutors. You hear Senator Dodd, Senator Chris Dodd's father, speaking in his own voice. You hear Sidney Alderman in his own voice. I mean, a lot of courtroom participants that you now get to hear in their own voices. Plus, you get to hear a little bit of Roman Rudenko, the Russian prosecutor, a little bit of Champetier de Ribes, the French prosecutor. And as I say, the German defendants speaking in their own, as my father put it, their own lame voices. So this turns out to have made a huge impact on the experience of watching the film. Then in terms of the original narration, or the rest of the narration, we hired Liev Schreiber. I hired Liev Schreiber to read the original narration. Because again, the intent was not to change the film, but to restore it and to reconstruct the sound. I did make a few changes to the narration that Liev read, but very minor ones. For instance, wherever possible, I introduced a first name just to help a modern audience know who was being talked about. So it used to say Rudenko, and now we say Roman Rudenko. It used to say Heydrich, and now it says, he reads Reinhard Heydrich. So wherever there was room, time really in the soundtrack, space, I put in first names. And also when they were referring to the Reichstag, I was concerned that an audience today, especially a young audience, wouldn't know what the Reichstag was. So I put in a positive phrase, you know, the National Congress. But these were really slight modifications that don't change the content of the film. They simply enhance, I think, the comprehension for a modern audience. And Liev did a brilliant job of recording the original narration, so that we preserved the original narration. Then, of course, we had to do the picture restoration. I mean, all of the original negatives, or the original negative, and all of the underlying sound elements had been lost or destroyed along the way. And it turned out that the American materials were in such bad shape. When I'd finally raised enough money after 5 years to do this, it turned out that the American materials were in such bad shape that we couldn't use them for making a new negative. So at that point, the German Bundesarchiv, Filmarchiv in Berlin, loaned me their best 35 millimeter print. And Color Lab in Rockville, Maryland, which specializes in restoration, made a new negative for me using the best extant German print. The hardest thing we did was actually, technically speaking, was reconstructing the music track, because obviously there was no question of changing the music, and yet the original music tracks had disappeared, and we had no score either. I found in my father's paper a kind of gift from Hans Otto Borgmann to my father, which was his handwritten, just 8 cues, of just a few bars of these 8 cues, handwritten on staff paper, and inscribed to Stuart. So they gave us a tiny hint as to the chord structure and orchestration of just these first bars of some of these cues. But essentially, we had to hire a composer, a brilliant composer, who listened to the original music, which you could hear on the old prints, and recompose it by ear, and then reorchestrate it on a synthesizer, because I didn't have the funds to hire an orchestra to re-record it. And then we took his reconstruction of the music and we dirtied it up in the sound mix so that it would have the same aural quality as the original, because we had been able to save a few bits of the original where it was clear of narration or clear of sound effects, and matched all that together seamlessly. That was the brilliance of Josh Waletsky and John Califra, who made that happen.
Well,
a miracle.
Well, it's a miracle you brought this movie back. It's a miracle, and just a real tribute to your tenacity. that
It did require some tenacity.
we're here today, and gosh, this is very exciting.
It is exciting. It's very exciting to be at this historic location, to be here in Chautauqua, and to be presented by the Jackson Center. You know, what you've accomplished is very important, and it means a lot to me that the Jackson Center is presenting Nuremberg here, and I think that the film is a testimony to Jackson's vision, a very, very important vision, and that comes shining through in the film. So it's a fitting tribute to Justice Jackson. It's a fitting tribute to the Jackson Center, and it's a thrill to have it shown here at Chautauqua.
Thank you, Sandra Schulberg. This is great.
Thank you. Sorry I broke down there.
You kidding me?
In Nuremberg, the people of the world found out and why. But Nuremberg is more than an answer to a question. As Justice Jackson said, this trial is part of the great effort to make the peace more secure. It constitutes juridical action of a kind to ensure that those who start a war will pay for it personally. Nuremberg stands as a warning to all those who plan and wage aggressive war.